Okay, people are ticking in from the waiting room, but I'm going to get started to make the best use of time and start my welcome remarks at this point. So a very warm welcome to everyone to this free webinar from the Mammal Society. This is one of a series of webinars that we run throughout the year. We try and run a free webinar at least every month to complement our training program, which hopefully many of you will be aware of. And we hope to continue to be able to do that. We're hugely grateful to our speaker who's joining us today, Professor Hal Whitehead, a university research professor in the Department of Biology at Dalhousie University. And as he's going to talk to us about today, his research focuses on social organization and cultural transmission in mammals, particularly deep water whales. I don't want to give too much else away about Professor Hal Whitehead's excellent and very interesting career. But before I hand over to him, I will just say a little bit about the Mammal Society for those who might not know so much about the organization. So we are a national organization focused on the promotion and support of mammal conservation. We do a huge amount of work to support and lead research into mammal biology and behavior and population. But we also do a lot to enable people of all backgrounds to get involved in mammal conservation, whether that's through our local groups network or our work with students, universities, and schools. So if you're interested in the work we do, we also run, as I mentioned before, a really packed training program about all aspects of mammal conservation, monitoring, and mitigation. And if you are a member of the Mammal Society, as well as getting our member magazine every quarter and various other exciting elements of a welcome pack and benefits throughout the year, you also get substantial discounts on our training and our annual conference and our events. Or if you just love these webinars, but you're happy to support us to continue offering them for free, a one-off donation is hugely appreciated. I mentioned our conference. It is coming up. Tickets will only be on sale for another week or so. If you are interested in this field, it's a really exciting 2 days of really fascinating talks and workshops. It is taking place in my hood, in Inverness, in Scotland, up in the Highlands, at the end of March. However, there is also an online ticket that you can buy to experience the presentations and feed in your questions via hybrid attendance. So just follow that link or search Mammal Society Conference for more details. And then finally, just a little plug before I hand over to Professor Whitehead. Also coming up at the end of April, so 1 month after our conference, is National Mammal Week. So for those of you that haven't got involved in previous National Mammal Weeks, this is our annual opportunity to really promote mammals, their importance, the challenges they face, and to get people involved in mammal monitoring. And this year, we're asking people to get involved in the Mammal Discovery Challenge, which is basically getting out and monitoring the mammals that are visiting your garden, your school ground, your university campus, or your local space. And we can give you lots of support and advice and guidance in how to do that in ways that are fun and free. And the data that is collected throughout that week will be a really valuable thing to repeat year on year and compare and see how we're doing in terms of national mammal populations. And there's also loads of other ways that you can get involved in National Mammal Week. So do visit our website for a bit more information about that. But that's enough from me. I'm going to pass over to our guest speaker, Professor Hal Whitehead, and let him share his screen and say a little bit more about this very exciting topic today.
Share. I don't see the share. Moment.
Should be wherever it was before.
More. Try more. Oh, sure. Here it is. Yeah, found it.
And don't
Okay.
forget the audio tick box.
Right. Audio. Share sound. Yeah. Uh, Let me know if you can see that and you can hear me. Okay.
That's
Both.
all working. Please go ahead. It's lovely.
Okay. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure for me to talk about culture and culture in mammals. So, what I'm going to do is first say what we biologists conceive of as culture, and and why we study it in wild animals, and then I will say a little bit about the uh, discoveries of culture across the animal kingdom, but I'll obviously concentrate on mammals and go through a bunch of kinds of mammals where we do know something about their culture, and I'll end concentrating on the whales, which are the animals that I study. Okay, um, so this is a cultured dolphin, and you'll have to wait till the end of the talk if you don't know what's going on here. I'll explain right at the end. Um, but first, what is culture? Um, Culture is had thousands of definitions, and uh, it's mainly defined by anthropologists, historians, and others in the social sciences. And many of them really don't like the idea of us zoologists either especially defining cultures, but even to some extent studying cultures. So I hope you can see the slide which says what is culture at the top. Yeah. And so this is the definition of culture that my colleague Luke Rendell and I use, but it's also very close to the definitions used by other zoologists studying other animals, especially in the wild. So it has three important elements. First, it's information or behavior. So in human terms, this is either the dance or the knowledge of how to do the dance. So that would be the behavior, would be the dance, the information would be the knowledge of how to do the dance, even if you don't do it. Secondly, it's acquired by social learning. That means learning from other individuals, and almost always, but not quite always, from members of the same species. So, because you are associating with, in some way, another member of your species, you gather information or behavior that you might not have got otherwise. So, culture is social, it's built on social learning. And thirdly, it's shared. So, the result of this is that you have a bunch of individuals who do the same thing or have the same information because they've learned it from one another. This definition, as perhaps I inferred, is not liked by some, but not all anthropologists, but it has been proven to be a very useful definition for those of us who study culture in other creatures. And we have found culture in a whole bunch of other creatures. And in fact, one of the uh, first, why do we study it? And obviously, we're interested in these other creatures. That's why we are zoologists. So we want to understand their lives and how their lives work and what are the influences on their lives. And if culture is part of that, we would like to know about that. And that can help us with other things, thinking about evolution, thinking about ecology, thinking about conservation. But secondly, we humans are the ultra-cultural species. So just about everything we do has a very, very strong influence from social learning and leads us to behave in ways which are shared by a bunch of humans. So for a while it was thought humans were the only cultural species. We are clearly not, but we are cultural in an extreme way. And that influences what we are as humans. So learning how culture works in other species can help us put how we behave in some kind of context. And thirdly, and this is from the point of view of evolutionary biologists, we're interested in how life on Earth evolved. And this is normally, generally thought of in terms of genetic evolution. But it's becoming clear that there are other kinds of inheritance other than genes. There are other reasons why one individual is like another. It can inherit a range of things. It can inherit a home range. There are epigenetic inheritances. And culture is another form of inheritance, a way two individuals are like each other, which doesn't directly involve genes. And so, as evolutionary biologists, we're interested in these alternative heritabilities, how they work and how they might interact with the genetic heritabilities that we mostly study. So, culture across the animal kingdom. And I'm going to start with an example from Britain that, especially for those of you who are more my age, may bring back memories. And wait a minute, let me go back. Okay. Sorry. I'm going to talk about culture across the animal kingdom. First, insects. And there has been quite a bit of study of culture in insects, mainly in experimental circumstances. And they can show that cultures can propagate through experimental colonies of fruit flies, of bees, and so on. There's a concern about the culture of insects, especially in temperate or colder climates, because no insect is going to live of many species, is going to live from 1 year to the next. So how is the culture propagated? So that's an issue with culture in insects. I'm not going to say any more about that, but it's a really interesting subject. Fish. One of the first and best studies of culture outside birds and mammals was on coral reef fish. And there was a very convincing study showing that in the wild, their mating sites are culturally determined. They learn where to mate from each other. More recently, there has been a lot of interest in how their migrations are determined. And this is an example which is close to my home and my interests. I worked for many years in Newfoundland, which is an island whose economy for centuries was dependent on the codfish and the migrations of the codfish, allowing a very massive fishery. In 1989, that fishery collapsed. In 1992, there was a complete moratorium on fishing. It was expected the codfish, each female having millions of eggs, would build back very quickly. It didn't. And one of the prime ideas for why it didn't build back was that the fishery took all the older individuals who knew the migrations of the codfish, which we now know are important and somewhat complex. And the younger cod, the smaller cod had no one to follow. They did not learn the migration patterns, and the cod have done very badly, and they still have not returned to their abundance before the moratorium. Birds have been very well studied, and a lot of the best evidence for culture in non-humans comes from birds. Obviously the songs, but also the migrations of animals like cranes, as well as food choices by animals like great tits. And in each of these cases, songs, migrations, food choice, genes play a part, but a lot of what's done by some species, not all, is learned from others. So quite a lot of passerines songs are cultural. If they don't have experience of other animals singing, they cannot sing proper songs. Similarly for migrations, for animals like these cranes, and food choice. So culture is really important for birds. This is what I was changing. Sorry. This is the famous case from Britain, and it's in the top pattern here is for 1936, and it shows where these great tits were doing something which people of my generation may remember. They would we would have the bottles of milk delivered to our door every morning. The cream would be at the top. The great tits would peck through the foil top and drink the cream. And in one of the first studies of the spread of culture in a non-human, it was shown how this spread across Britain. Initially, it's in Britain, in around London, down towards Southampton and up in the north of England. And then over the next decade, it spreads and spreads, and until about 1945, it's pretty much all over England, spreading into Wales and into Scotland. And there's no really other explanation for this than the birds were learning this behavior from each other. How they were learning it is an interesting question, which I will not go into. But we're here to talk about mammals. What about culture in mammals? Culture has been found in a range of mammals, including rats. It's been studied extensively in the lab, but one of the best studies from the wild is rats in Israel who strip pine cones to get the goodies inside the cones. And they do this with a particular technique which involves taking the outer parts off in a spiral maneuver. A naive rat who's never seen this can't usually do it. They learn this usually from their mothers, and so this is spread through the population. This is culture. I've got elephants in here, and we most of us assume that elephants with their incredibly complex social systems, ecological variability and so on, would have sophisticated culture. And quite a lot of elephant scientists will say that, but there's actually rather little definitive proof of this, which to me is a shame. On the other hand, some other mammals, we're getting really good proof. So, for instance, in ungulates, we're getting good evidence for migrations and habitat use. And this is one of the most famous examples by Jesmer and his colleagues, published about 5 years ago. And what they showed was that in the American and Canadian West, that reintroduced populations of bighorn sheep and moose do not migrate like the historical herd. So these animals were extirpated from many areas mainly by massive hunting. But because people like to hunt them, they reintroduced them from other areas where the hunting had been less. And initially, the animals did not migrate like the original ones did. However, after several decades, newly established herds became increasingly migratory. And it is shown remarkably here. The time since translocation, 210 years. Initially, none are migratory, and then after, well, nearly 200 years, nearly everybody is migratory. So they gradually learn how to migrate in this. So individuals innovate a bit, the others learn from it, and after a while, they get back the original migrations. So newly introduced animals learned about the environment gradually and then shared the information. Well, the most study and probably interest in culture in non-humans is for the primates, obviously us in particular, but other primates as well. And there have been some lovely studies of monkeys, both in the Americas and Asia and Africa. I'm just going to pick out one genus, the capuchins. These are monkeys of the New World. And in Brazil and that area, there are brown capuchins. And they use tools to get food. So, for instance, this capuchin is using a big rock to get the shell of a cashew nut, I believe. And you can see the baby is watching and imitating the actual physical movements of the adult, who may well be the mother. And so these capuchins are using what they learn from each other to exploit the resources that they depend on. And similar things have been found, for instance, on Japanese monkeys, macaques, as well as vervet monkeys in Africa. But there are other species of capuchin. And the white-faced capuchin, which have studied particularly in Costa Rica, are less dependent on culture for getting food, but they use culture in their social conventions in extremely weird ways. So two capuchins may spend a while busily sniffing each other's hands, fair enough. They may suck each other's body parts, a bit weird, and then they will also put their fingers in each other's eyes, extremely weird. All of these behaviors and a whole bunch more are common in some groups of capuchins. And then not too far away, there's another group who doesn't do this particular one, but does something else. So these social conventions are extreme and really interesting. Initially, there was a thought that maybe these were symbols of the different groups, that we are the group who pokes each other's eyeballs. But it doesn't look like that happens, because when they do the eyeball poking, it's two individuals go off sort of by themselves and do it. So it seems more that within these groups, these behaviors have evolved as a kind of social bonding routine. So if you let someone poke your eyeball and they let you poke their eyeball, then maybe you really are best buddies. Even more attention has gone to the non-human great apes. And there's been a lot of studies, particularly of chimpanzees, but also a fair amount now of gorillas and orangutans. And there's much variation in behavior between sites in feeding, tool use, communication, social conventions, and play behavior. Now, because there's differences between the behavior in different sites, it's a little complicated, because this could be due to ecological differences, obviously, particularly with things like feeding. they're feeding on different things in different sites, or tool use, if there are different tools available at different sites. Less so with social conventions and play. But there's been a lot of study now, and even much feeding. So, for instance, the way they, and tool use. So, for instance, the way they use sticks to feed on termites has been shown to be cultural and extremely extremely complex, and the complexities are learned from each other. So most of this variation seems to be cultural. And it's thought, certainly with chimpanzees, that the information they get from each other is absolutely crucial to how they live their lives. Okay, and oh yeah, here's an example. This is a social convention. So chimpanzee culture is bound together to some considerable extent by grooming. Individuals groom each other and so build up bonds. And if you're grooming another individual, you're trying to get rid of the grotty things that have accumulated on their body. And one of the sites where grotty things accumulate most is in the armpit. So chimpanzees groom each other's armpits, and they can do this simultaneously if each individual puts up the arm of the armpit that's going to be groomed, and they hold them, then each can get at the armpit of the other with its other hand. And there's two ways this is done, and this is shown in the picture. In the left one, they're holding each other's wrists, and in the right one, they flop their hands over each other. And depending on the site, they may use one or other of these techniques. These seem to be cultural behaviors, well, they're pretty much certainly cultural behaviors, which the chimpanzees learn from each other. Well, now I'm going to move on to the whales. And these are the animals I study. And given that whales are generally a lot harder to study than birds or great apes, there's a remarkable amount of information, which I think speaks to the importance of culture for these animals. So I'm just going to give a couple of examples. So first, the baleen whales. The baleen whales are the animals with great sheets of keratin hanging from the top of their mouths, which form nice filters, which mean they can eat, they can grab a huge bunch of food, usually fairly small food, in one gulp. And many of the baleen whales have a seasonal, are very seasonal in how they use food and how they use places. So, for instance, and best known are the humpback whales. So, in the North Atlantic, humpback whales are found in the summer right across the northern areas, from here off Nova Scotia, where I live, further north off Newfoundland, off West Greenland, and on the eastern side of North America, off Iceland, the eastern side of the Atlantic, off Iceland, and in the Barents Sea, north of Norway and Russia. Now, some of them stay here in the winter, but most of them migrate south to warm waters in the autumn and spend the winter in these warm waters. And there are three main areas: the Greater Antilles, especially some offshore banks off the north of the Dominican Republic, the Lesser Antilles of islands like the British Virgin Islands, Antigua, and so on, and on the eastern side of the Cape Verde Islands. And generally, the animals from the Cape Verdes come from the Eastern Atlantic, but any of them can go to the wintering grounds in the Caribbean. Okay. And then in the spring and in the winter, they mate, and then a year later, the females give birth to their calves. In the winter, they eat very little, if at all, and in the summer, they eat like crazy and get really fat and use that fat to survive during the winter. So that's the annual cycle of humpback whales. Now, the calf is born in the warm water breeding grounds, and she or he accompanies their mother on the first migration north. So if the mother is going to Atlantic Canada, the calf goes to Atlantic Canada. If the mother's going to the Barents Sea, the calf goes to the Barents Sea. And then it's repeating. If it was born, say, in the Greater Antilles and went to Atlantic Canada, it will generally keep doing that year after year after year. So that will be its migration. It returns to the mother's feeding, breeding ground, and just keeps doing it. But not fathers. So the mother may have been, in this case, was from Atlantic Canada. The father could have been from Iceland or the Barents Sea or the Gulf of Maine, but the baby just does what its mother did. And this is really culture. So the migrations are a really good example of culture in the baleen whales, but there are other examples. And this is the most famous example, the humpback whale songs. So humpback whales in those, well, mostly when they're in those wintering grounds. So now if you go down to those banks north of the Dominican Republic, and even if you just put your ear up against the side of your boat and the engine isn't running, you will almost certainly hear the songs of humpback whales. These are long, elaborate, circular sets of vocalizations. They are sung just by males on these warm water breeding grounds, or primarily on the warm water breeding grounds. And all males in any ocean basin at any time sing essentially the same song. So if you go to the Lesser Antilles, the Greater Antilles, Cape Verde, you'll hear more or less the same song. But that song is slowly evolving over months and years. The song that they started with when they first got down there, say in December, may have changed a bit since then. And the song they'll be singing in a year's time down there will have changed a fair bit more. It just slowly evolves. There's a song in the Pacific, North Pacific, which is also slowly evolving over months and years, but it's different from the Atlantic song. However, although the songs are different, they follow the same rules. And now I'm going to try and play a bit. I just flicked up, except the Australian Revolution, which is something I won't go into, but if you want to ask me about that, I'm happy to talk about it. Now, the Song of the Humpback Whale is an extraordinary. One cycle of the song could be 15 to 20 or over 20 minutes. And then the whale goes back to the beginning again and it can sing for 24 hours. It's an extraordinary song with a huge range of tones. It's been called the most elaborate acoustic signal of any animal. And it's also been called one of the best examples of culture in non-humans. You cannot get anything like the humpback song without animals listening to each other and changing their behavior based on what they've listened to. And there's a lot we don't know about humpback song, and it's absolutely captivating. It's also very beautiful. If you haven't heard it, go and listen. And that was from the song that was put out in 1971 as a long-playing record, which at that time was how you put out music, and it went to the top of the hit parade. So there's a lot of culture in the baleen whales. I'm now going to talk about the toothed whales, and again, I'm going to concentrate on one species, and that is the sperm whale, which is the animal I study. It's an extraordinary creature, even though if you ask a kid to draw a whale, they might draw a sperm whale. It's nothing like the other whales. It's the most divergent species of all whales and dolphins around. It's the largest toothed animal on Earth. It has the largest brain on Earth. It has the largest nose on Earth, which turns out to be a sonar system which can make the sound with the highest pressure, the loudest sound of any animal. The sperm whales around today eat nearly as much as all human fisheries combined. They're found all around the world. And there used to be maybe 2 or 3 times as many of them before we started killing them. They also had the greatest sexual segregation of any animal. The female sperm whales are in the tropics, and the males are in the Arctic and Antarctic, which is pretty weird. These are highly social animals, which is what really interests me. So this picture, taken using a drone by my colleague Anna, from the waters off the Galapagos, shows at least 60 sperm whales. So that's about 800 tons of mammal in this one picture. And you can see that they're clearly social. They like being beside each other. And there's a lot of stuff going on here. They're touching each other, they're rolling, and they do a lot of other things. Well, we've been studying their societies for quite a few years. And one of the biggest roots into their behavior, as with the humpback whales, has been their sounds. Now, the sperm whale sounds aren't as beautiful as the humpback. They are patterned series of clicks used for communication. So here are some sperm whales communicating. That was 2 whales making little patterns at each other, and then the end, they just overlay them on top of each other, kind of like a duet. So the codas have been really important in our understanding of sperm whales and their world. We study them off the Galapagos Islands, and we get to know them individually and their social relationships. So this is just a pattern of their social network, their social structure. Each of the little dots is a sperm whale, and the black lines show who we saw them associating with. The blue and red circles are their social units. So these sperm whales are found in social units of about 10 animals each. These are females, juveniles, and other young animals, babies. And these are permanent. So a female is born into this social unit. She stays in it for life and raises her offspring there. The males leave in their teens. So you can see the social units and how a lot of the social relationships are within the social units, but not all. They do have relationships between social units. So that's their social network of the Galapagos. And as you can see, there are two bunches of social units, the blue ones and the red ones, which do not associate. And this is the acoustic repertoire. This shows how similar the acoustics of one social unit is to the other. And as you can see, the top ones, the ones with the blue circle around, have one kind of repertoire. They tend, I'll play it in a minute, whereas the bottom ones with the red circle around them have a different repertoire. We call them the regular and the +1 clan because the top ones sound like this. I'll play that again. Interrupted it. So their patterns of clicks tend to be just regularly spaced. The +1 clan sound a bit different. There's a pause before the last click. And they do this whether they're making 4 clicks or 8-click coders, whatever. There's a pause before the end. So we have the animals in this area can be divided into these 2 clans, which only associate with members of their own clan and have distinctive repertoires in how they communicate. We've looked at genetics, and in the nuclear genes, which determine behavior, there is absolutely no difference between the two different clans. We've looked at the behavior, and there are distinctive behavioral differences between the regular clan. For instance, when we're following the regular clan, they wiggle around, they go a bit this way, and then they go a bit that way, and it's a right pain to follow them in our boat. The +1 clan are much better. They tend to go in straight lines. The +1 clan are better at babysitting. They stagger their dives, so there's usually an animal up with the calves. The regular clan aren't so good at that. And in a study a few years ago by one of my colleagues, Taylor Hirsch, she got coda repertoires, the recordings of these click patterns from right across the Pacific, from Japan to Chile, from British Columbia to New Zealand. And she worked out which clan was found where. And most of it, we have the best data from the Galapagos, where we've done our studies, but she got data from all these different places. And she found 7 clans in the Pacific. Some of them had huge ranges, like the short clan are found right across the Pacific. Others are much more localized. The +1 clan, the second one I played there, has been heard only off Ecuador and the Galapagos. Now, about 7 clans in the Pacific. We know there's roughly 150,000 females in the Pacific. This means 20,000 females per clan. So this is a cultural entity on a scale which we know of nothing like it except humans. So each of these female sperm whales is member of a clan, and there's maybe 20,000 or so other females who are members of that clan, most of whom she will not meet. But if she did meet them, she would know they are one of us. So I find this pretty extraordinary. Well, to summarize, culture is common and important for many mammals. And a good reason for this is because mammals suckle, they're young. So this means there's usually a fairly long and sometimes a very long bond between the mother and the young mammal. And this is a great opportunity for the young mammal to learn from the mother and the animals around the mother how to behave. And the culture in mammals includes vital behaviors, so the migrations of ungulates and baleen whales, the foraging methods of chimpanzees, of killer whales, of capuchins, the fishing cooperatives between dolphins and humans. So there are these cultural things which work between species, where the dolphins learn from dolphins, the humans from humans, and they learn from each other's. Extraordinary things like the songs of the humpback whale. There are social conventions like the grooming hand clasp in chimpanzees, the greeting ceremonies of orcas. And then there's even arbitrary play behavior, which I haven't talked about. Orangutans will jump on rotten trees and break them and ride to the ground. A wonderful, fun ride for an orangutan. The Japanese macaques will just pick up stones and do weird stuff with them. No function, just fun. Orcas, for a while, started wearing salmon hats, putting a salmon on the head and going around. And that was cool for a few months, and then it faded and waited for 25 years and then started up again. And then that dolphin in the top right is tail walking. It's walking on its tail. This is something that isn't done by wild dolphins in South Australia, where this dolphin is from. But this dolphin got sick, was taken into an aquarium and learned it from the performing dolphins in the aquarium, even though it never was trained to do this. It went out in the wild, did it, and some of its buddies picked it up. So this was another culture. So culture is important for many mammals, and some could not live without it. I suspect chimpanzees, killer whales, sperm whales, and probably quite a range of others could not live without it. And it's really important as we think about how to conserve mammals that we also think about how culture works for them. Because culture can make it easier for them to deal with the threats we pose. They can quickly learn ways around some of the issues we're causing them. Or it can lead to them being very conservative and less likely to do the sensible thing as we change their environment. And it has many other implications for how we try to conserve these animals. So thank you very much. If there are any questions, I'll try and answer.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor Whitehead. I think I speak for everyone when I say there were lots of incredible thought-provoking facts in there. We've got a few questions in the Q&A, so I'll run through them. I'm going to take chair's prerogative and just ask one at the top, which relates to what you were just saying there at the end about play behavior, I guess, especially. I just wondered if there was a qualitative difference, if we're looking at it, I guess, intelligence, possibly consciousness. Is there a qualitative difference in behavior that we describe as cultural if it serves no purpose in survival and natural selection, which of course migration routes, learned behaviors that increase foraging or hunting success and even communication can, but some of those play behaviors clearly don't?
Well, the thought, us being very human-centered, the initial thought was you need to be really, really smart to have culture. And so the initial thought, oh, well, we're looking at the animals with big brains, like the great apes, in elephants, in the whales. But we find culture much broader than, we find a lot of cultural behavior in fish, probably some in insects and so on. And in fact, theoretically, that makes sense. Because if you think, what is the point of culture? Well, the sort of most basic point, it's a shortcut. So say, the environment changes and your usual food isn't available. What do you do? Well, you can go around giving a bite on everything, and that can be very time consuming, and it can potentially be dangerous. Or you can look around and say, oh, look what old Joe over there's eating, and he looks fat and healthy, and just copy that. And cognitively, that's probably easier than doing all the individual exploration. So there's no obvious reason on the surface why cultural animals should be cognitively advanced. What some people, including me, think is that when culture becomes really important for an animal, so a lot of their behavior is culturally determined, where there are a lot of models you could choose from for particular behavior, where you're combining all these different possible sources of information with your own experience, with what your genes say, and so on, then that becomes really hard. And so, if you think about how hard it may have been for some of us, perhaps, to find a career, and we're putting together all kinds of information from all kinds of sources and trying to make a rational decision, that's a really difficult thing to do. But just saying, that looks like a good thing to eat because those guys who are eating are doing very well. That isn't. So there is a sort of cultural brain hypothesis that culture can lead to the development of complex brains, but it isn't a necessity to have a complex brain to have culture.
Oh, that's fascinating. Thank you. Okay, well, I'll run. There's questions have been piling in. I'm aware of time, so I'm just going to fire some at you. I think this one, I think you did come back round to this, so you might feel you've answered it, but I'll just answer Carmel's question. I also thought migration, sorry, I always thought migration was instinctual, but you say it's cultural, i.e., socially learned. What's the difference between instinct and culture as a factor influencing animal behavior?
Yeah. So it can be instinctual or it can be culture. And in birds, this has been studied a lot. So, for instance, some birds, if you raise them from an egg with no experience of other birds, will not know how or when or where to migrate. Some will. So, for some, it is instinctual, for some, it's cultural. For whales, it's almost certainly always cultural, although there are probably instinctual, i.e., genetic elements like, you know, it's getting cold up here, let's head to the tropics, might have a genetic basis. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, no, that's clear. Quick one here from Sarah. Should we expect culture does exist in most socially complex species? It just might not have been identified yet. For example, in giraffes who have fission fusion social systems. And what sort of studies would need to be done to explore it in animals like giraffes and elephants?
Yeah, I think it's very likely that in pretty much any um, uh, social species, and even in some not very social species. Orangutans aren't terribly social, but with detailed studies, they found quite a bit of culture there. Minke whales aren't very social, and there's a bit of evidence for culture in minke whales. So uh, I would expect it in many species. Depending on the social structure of the animals, how visible they are, how acoustic they are. Acoustics is often a really good way to get a line into culture. That it's much easier or harder to study them. So, for instance, I study two toothed whale species, the sperm whale and the northern bottlenose whale. I've been studying each of them for over 30 years and spent a lot of my life out with them and collecting data and analyzing it and so on. And because of the social structure of the sperm whales, the social units, the clans, and so on, we have a really good uh, window into their culture, and we know a lot. Relatively quite a lot about it. I've been looking for a window into the social structure of the bottlenose whales for most of those 30 years, and I haven't found one yet. So I don't think that's because they're not cultural. I think they may well be culture, but because their populations aren't divided up in a way which we can identify, um, and because they don't, well, we haven't found any clear greeting ceremonies or things like grooming hand clasps. We haven't found anything for them, but I suspect they have culture. And so for giraffes, fission fusion societies, if it's a true fission fusion, so the things are mixing up over all kinds of timescales, are harder to find culture on without very detailed studies. So there's a detailed study of bottlenose dolphins in Australia and some elsewhere where they have found culture, but it needs to be very detailed. In the societies like killer whales, like sperm whales, like chimpanzees, which are well divided up into separate groups of animals, it is much easier to find culture.
Okay, thank you. Now this one brings this kind of area of study bang up to date. So I have a question regarding cultural transmission and climate change. Since migration and habitat use are considered part of culturally transmitted knowledge in cetaceans, do you think that rapid climate-driven environmental changes could alter or disrupt cultural transmission processes? And in particular, could the speed of climate change outpace the transmission of adaptive cultural information?
Yes, it could. So cultural change can help with things like climate change, but it can also inhibit it. So, for instance, orcas on the west coast of North America continue to use really polluted waters off, say, Seattle, because it's part of their culture, their tradition, when there are much better waters they could use. So it can work that way. But for instance, the right whales off the east coast of North America a lot of them used to feed in the Bay of Fundy in the summers, and then climate change really changed the value of the Bay of Fundy, and they relatively quickly moved into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, which had better feeding. It maybe had paused, it was a real shame because they just set up all these traffic separation zones in the Bay of Fundy to keep the ships away from the whales, and suddenly they'd gone into another area where the ships weren't regulated. So there are, the culture of the whales did help them deal with the feeding issue, but it caused a problem with the ship issue.
Right, it's so complex. Okay, a quick question actually, on from Fran regarding your last slides in your lecture. Is the study of the plasticity and rigidity of animal cultures already a branch of behavioral science, or is it perhaps a new approach?
It very much is, yes, and there's evidence that. People are looking at the rigidity of it. So some things seem extremely stable. So the foraging behavior of killer whale ecotypes seems really stable and fixed and hard to change. And Similarly, some of the nut cracking behavior of chimpanzees, they've done archaeological work and found that they were using similar tools to crack nuts in that area hundreds, thousands of years ago. So, there's some very stable cultures, but there's also some extremely unstable ones, like putting a salmon on your head, which lasted, just a few months. Yes.
Yeah, that was it was interesting. I wasn't aware that it had happened before, and that it's something that's come around again after some time. I didn't know there was documentation before. I've got we're at time, so we're going to have to draw it to a close. And I realise there are some questions unanswered, so apologies. Tried to prioritize the upvoted ones. I'm just going to ask one more that came in on the chat. Someone couldn't access the Q&A. And it's into a different area of culture. So my question is on the human-animal connections in culture, where humans feed wild animals. In some parts of India, for example, wild birds and macaques are fed unhealthy human foods. Perhaps humans do this out of their need to connect with nature. How does one treat this kind of culture? I wonder if you've got any thoughts on that.
Well, it's extremely difficult, and there are issues like this in many situations. Either humans deliberately feeding the animals, and this happens with, say, dolphins in the southern US and in Australia. Elephants being fed in Sri Lanka, um, and, and, um, and usually these are bad for the animals. And what one needs to do is to control the humans, and this is controlling humans is incredibly difficult. And there are a few good examples, and one of the best is in Australia in Shark Bay, where the dolphins were being fed by humans at a resort. And the detailed studies there showed this was not good for the dolphins. The calves weren't surviving well. The authorities took that on board. They regulated the feeding and, changed it to just feeding a few animals, a little bit of food at certain times of day. And the effects now are minimal. So it can be done, but it takes a lot of will, and it's difficult.
I think that happens at all scales of conservation. Considering human
Yes.
wildlife conflict is sometimes considering
Yes.
humans seeking out the connection. Well, it just remains for me to say a huge thank you to Professor Whitehead for that fantastic talk. And thank you to everyone that joined and fed in some really interesting questions and a few additional pieces of information on the chat for people attending there. I hope you don't mind how I've shared the link to your page on the university website, which has contact details in case anyone has any follow-up since they were already online. I hope that's all right. So yeah, it's just again a massive thank you, and I hope everyone's found this as stimulating as I have. So we'll end the call, and the recording will be circulated to those who've registered. So look out for that in your inboxes over the coming days. Thank you again.
Thank you all.